Hello and welcome to the fourth installment of the Stoics. This week we are going to look at Epictetus. Hi everyone. This lecture comes to you slightly later in the week than previous ones. That's partly because I've been looking after my 2-year-old son much more this week. I've been trying to teach him Epictetus, but it hasn't been going very well. I've been telling him, look, Yasha, things themselves are neither good nor bad. What counts are our opinions about things. But then he just cries and throws his shoes around. So I'm hoping that Marcus Aurelius is going to work more successfully with him. Anyway, hopefully over the next hour or so I can teach you some Epictetus and you won't throw your shoes around. Let's see. Right, let's get into it. So we have come across Epictetus a little bit indirectly through some other people much earlier in our course. You'll remember James Stockdale, the fighter pilot who is shot down over North Vietnam. We're going to come back to him a bit later. For him, the major inspiration for turning to the Stoics is Epictetus in particular. So let's think about why that might be. Another book that I recommended to some of you at the beginning of this course, How to be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci. For him, Epictetus has been of most influence to his decision to convert to Stoicism in the way that he makes out. I think John Sellers' book is more of a useful introduction to the Stoics. That's why we've worked with that more. But if you want an Epictetus-driven entrance to the Stoics, this is a good place to start. Right. So before we give you a bit of an overview, let's just turn to some comics. Because Epictetus is one of the most recurring characters in the existential comics series, which I think I might have used before on some other courses. It's absolutely fantastic. Let's see how Epictetus is presented here. So in this strip, Epictetus is giving relationship advice. Epictetus says, "Hi, I'm Epictetus, your relationship counselor. So tell me, why did you come in today?" First guy, "Well, it seems like we are always fighting." Yaffa lady. "The problem is he's just so lazy." Epictetus, "Remember that we can't control the virtue of others, only our own virtue." That makes sense, right? Then what happens? "Here's another tip. If you kiss your wife, say that you only kiss things which are human, and thus you will not be disturbed if she dies. After all, it is only humans in general that you love." "Wait, what?" says the guy. "That seems horrible. I love my wife in particular. I would be devastated if she died." Epictetus, "You love your wife? Well, you wouldn't be a very good Stoic then, would you?" That's kind of ridiculous, but if you have been reading your Epictetus already, you'll know that Epictetus has a lot to say about one's wife or one's children, that we should look upon them in the way we would look upon a jug, or something that we kind of like using, but ultimately is impermanent. We have to just accept that these things will disappear. We must premeditate that they will die so that we can live more effectively. But why the hell would we want to do that? Let's see Epictetus in action again. This is another strip where Epictetus is brought alongside the Buddha, who we're going to come across on this course in about 3 weeks' time, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Let's just see how this plays out. So the situation here is a board game, and our philosophers are either competing or not competing. So Nietzsche begins. "Ha, sorry, Epictetus. Ha ha ha, back to the start." He's got a winning card. "That's okay," says Epictetus. "What do you mean that's okay?" says Nietzsche. Epictetus, "What cards you get is beyond my control, so there is no use worrying about it." Nietzsche, "What? That's idiotic. You were almost at the end, and now you have to start over. You should be suffering." Epictetus, "You see, I've been visualizing the possibility of having to start over this whole time, so when it came to be, it could not harm me." The Buddha, "It isn't losing that causes suffering, Nietzsche. It is only the desire to win." Nietzsche, "Oh, shut up, Buddha. If you were really so enlightened, you wouldn't be losing. You are a losing loser." Epictetus, "The only thing you can control is your own virtue. And the most virtuous thing to do is fulfill your civic responsibilities, which is why I select moves that best help all the players." Nietzsche, "You were doing that on purpose. I thought you were just an idiot." The Buddha, "You must let go of your ego, Nietzsche, and see that the players, the pieces, and the board are all one." Nietzsche, "You have game-denying philosophies. You just want to sit there and do nothing. Why even play if you don't try to exert your will onto the game and win?" Now, on one level, it's just a comic, but I think quite brilliantly, This sums up the potential stakes of applying Epictetus's philosophy to our own lives. And we see the character here is someone who just seems to be emphasizing acceptance, even resignation. But Nietzsche's point, and I think this has kind of been a perspective that's kind of been hinted at in our in-person discussions so far, is that this is life denying. If we just simply learn to accept everything and not change the world, but only our own opinions about the world, then nothing really changes, and we could potentially remain in a very weak state, in a very repressed state. This might not be good for us. This could be even construed as a sign of weakness. This might be a kind of a sanctimonious or righteous weakness, but it's weakness nonetheless. So to what extent is there strength and power in what Epictetus is trying to say? I think there's a lot, but I think I might need to persuade you and pass. So let's see how we get on. Right, so the agenda for the next hour or so is this. We are first going to talk about Epictetus' life. We did the same with Seneca. His life is kind of different. We're then going to start getting into some of the key features of Epictetus' philosophy. We're using the handbook here, but I'm going to make reference to the discourses as we go along. So we're going to look at this central claim about understanding what is up to us and what that means. We're going to look at judgment within that. We're then going to move on to thinking about Epictetus's school in Nicopolis and thinking about the analogies that Epictetus used for training. So what is the kind of training that the handbook and his broader school and his philosophy, what is it trying to train us in? What are we going to become? Where are we trying to get to? What kind of freedom is being offered? Then a question that really follows out of the in-person discussions of the last 2 weeks. Is all of this stuff about managing our own opinions and judgments just quietism? Is there something even fatalistic about it, just about accepting things as they are, not even doing anything? Is there something quite dangerous politically or socially about, say, putting into practice what Epictetus is saying? I think you hear in terms of protests, because as I speak and as you listen, there have been a lot of protests in the United States. Is Epictetus a figure of resignation, or can we construe a kind of resistance here? I'm going to try and make the case a bit here, because I don't think I've succeeded as well as I should have so far in our discussions. I think we really need to put Epictetus and what he's trying to do in a kind of radical tradition, which in week 1 we called the materialist tradition. Finally, we're going to look at his legacy, kind of in terms of psychotherapy, but also in some other ways too. Okay, let's dive in. Right, so we start by introducing Epictetus. So who is this man? Well, here is the most common image. It's not one from his time, but it gives us a quick sense of who this man is. Studious, and you see in the cane, of course. Somebody who lived with a disability potentially a condition or an accident, or maybe the product of abuse when he was a slave. Now let's begin with just some key facts about Epictetus' life, as much as we know them. So he lives, he's born as a slave in Phrygia, in the province of Anatolia, which is now Turkey. He's born in year 50 CE, 50 AD. Now we can't be exactly sure what his real name was, because he's called Epictetus. But the Greek word epiktetos, it means gained or acquired, like property that's been gained or acquired. So it's a name, I guess, that is given to a slave that kind of says you are property. Strangely, he keeps that name and doesn't change it. And I guess it reflects not just his condition and his early life as a slave, but also the way that slavery, in a way, defines his thought and defines the way that he thinks about freedom versus slavery. Okay, let's get back to the facts. So Epictetus is born in year 50, and for his first 18 years, he's a slave. He's a slave to a man called Epaphroditus, and Epaphroditus is secretary to this guy. We met this guy last week. This is Nero, the Emperor Nero. Now, Epaphroditus was himself a slave at one point, and he becomes a freedman. He becomes very wealthy, as many do, like Seneca did under Nero. Epaphroditus allows Epictetus to study philosophy, which I guess is kind of unusual for a slave at this time. And it's kind of through this education that Epictetus becomes more learned and more philosophically aware. But bear in mind, in his first 18 years, he's still in slavery, and he's still, I guess, serving. I mean, he's kind of within quite an important household, but his role is still one of service within a very hierarchical Roman Empire, as opposed to a Roman Republic. One, and we saw this last week with Seneca, one in which that is defined by very often the most crass ambitions, a very violent and turbulent culture, a period where emperors like Caligula are often assassinated or forced to take their own lives in different ways. A world that's commemorating stuff like I, Claudius, and a world of instability that we kind of saw indirectly through the life of Seneca, somebody who he is given a death sentence 3 times by 3 different Roman emperors, and whose life, kind of reflects the fluctuations and instability of living within Roman society, if you're a member of the upper class. Now, of course, this is different for someone like Epictetus, who isn't kind of caught quite in this world of scheming ambition. And it's actually the death of Nero, which means that Epictetus becomes free. He's freed in the year 68, so he's aged 18 at this point. And, well, the rest, I suppose we could say, is history, but it's a history in which the facts are quite sketchy. We know that he studies for a period of time longer under Musonius Rufus. We met this guy last week when we were looking at female Stoic philosophers. Musonius Rufus, who is a Roman knight, part of the equestrian class, he advocates for women having the same rights and access to education as men, which seems kind of obvious to us, but was quite unusual in this time period. Not among all philosophical schools. In the Epicurean school, women were allowed to study alongside men, but in all the others, it was generally looked down on. So Epictetus, he's free in 68. And there's this kind of vague period up until the year 93. So I guess we're talking 25 years, where we can judge is learning philosophy and teaching philosophy in Rome. But then something changes. And this event, it reflects, I guess, the instability of Roman life and culture. And that's the rise to power of a new emperor, Domitian. And what Domitian does in the year 93 is he excludes all philosophers from Italy, from the Italian peninsula. Now, this isn't the first time that philosophers have been under attack from emperors. Of course, we know this when we think about what happened to Seneca. But even before Domitian in 93, Domitian's father, the Emperor Vespasian, had expelled all philosophers from the city of Rome. It's just that Domitian goes even further. This is Domitian, and excludes them from all of Italy. We're going to see this antagonistic relationship between philosophy and, interestingly, Stoic philosophy and the powers that be at various points on our course after this. It's also going to help us appraise the question of the challenge that Stoic philosophy could pose to the establishment, which so far, at least in our discussions, has seemed to be quite slight. But at least in the Roman world, in the Roman Empire, there was a group, now sometimes called the Stoic opposition, the Stoic resistance, which were critiquing the power of the emperors. Anyway, Epictetus, he's had a good career so far teaching philosophy, but we're not really sure in what way. But he's expelled, like others, from Italy, and so he goes traveling. Now, Epictetus he leaves Rome and he moves to the city of Nicopolis. Now, Nicopolis, I wish it were on your map. I should have drawn it on, but it's on the west coast of Greece, and it's a new city that's been built by the Romans to, I guess, establish and consolidate their power over the provinces of what is now Greece. This is called Epirus. Now, what was Nicopolis like? This place where Epictetus then establishes his school, and where, for all intents and purposes, the mature Epictetus that we know today comes from. Well, the place is largely ruins. We can assume that it was once a very wealthy, prosperous place. Now, we'll remember from the previous 2 weeks that Stoic philosophy comes from Greece, and it reflects, I guess, the fact that Greek culture, Greek mythology, Greek art, Greek philosophy have really high cultural status in Roman society. And so Romans, kind of young Roman men, learned Greek in order to learn Greek philosophy. And so Epictetus, when he sets up his school in Nicopolis, is teaching Romans. He's teaching the sons of powerful Romans. He's teaching the future Roman upper class in a Roman city that is in Greece. And these are going to be Romans who are, I guess, drawn to kind of to studying philosophy, and if not quite its cradle of Athens, there's somewhere certainly amenable to it. And it's because of this that Epictetus' philosophy survives. It doesn't survive because he writes it down, because he doesn't. But instead it's written down by one of his students, Flavius Arrian, who transcribes his lectures and teachings in a work that's called The Discourses. And then he also kind of gets almost like the best bits of the Discourses and combines it into an even smaller volume called a Handbook. And the Handbook is what we're going to look at. Again, not much in terms of facts. It's really present about Epictetus' life. So there is that whole question mark about the image of the disabled man with his cradle at the beginning. Where did he get that disability from? Was it from being abused as a slave, or was it some other condition? Again, the few commentaries about his life itself seem to disagree on this. But he has this school, it's in Nicopolis, and he's teaching the sons of wealthy Romans. He's teaching Arrian. And also while he's here, it's over a long period. It's from, I guess it's a 20-year period in which he's based in, which he's kind of at the height of his powers, I suppose. He the Emperor Hadrian comes to visit him and talk with him. And we can imagine that he is fairly kind of prominent and well known, at least in Roman intellectual circles. Epictetus is described as having quite a frugal, modest life. And even though he has this real emphasis on marriage and children in his works, he doesn't have he ends up kind of fostering, we would say nowadays, a child when he's quite old, and this is a child who had been abandoned, had been exposed in some way, and he cares for this child with the help of a woman, and we don't know if this was his wife, it's unclear. And he dies of old age in the year 113 CE. So for this period, it's not a bad lifespan, 63 years. And he's somebody who, I guess with his school, ends up having some degree of philosophical and cultural influence. But when we compare him to Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, he's not in the middle of political turmoil. And in some ways, his life is closer to Socrates, his idol, and the Stoic idol, because of its emphasis on schooling and learning and applying philosophy to our, or in his case, other people's everyday lives. This then raises an interesting question for us about how we can easily read Epictetus alongside someone like Marcus or alongside someone like Seneca, who are kind of writing in different contexts and writing for themselves. What we're going to look at and what we're going to discuss are a series of transcribed, almost like teaching guides, I guess, but they're guides about how to live. And one thing that really characterizes Epictetus more than any other Stoic that we've looked at or we will look at is this relentless emphasis on philosophy being a way of life. We've had it before, but Epictetus really strives for us to practice it. And even though his school is about kind of supplying a Stoic education in which the students would read some Zeno, they'd read some Chrysippus, they'd read some Cleanthes, the goal isn't just to understand other people's theories, but it's to put this into practice in the way that we live. Okay, right, let's get into the key bit of what Epictetus is trying to get us to think about, which is this question of what is up to us. Right, I want to just say a little bit before we land there about the handbook, the Enchiridion. Now, it literally is produced as a handbook. So Enchiridion is like literally it's a little thing to carry in the hand, and it's written in Greek. It's written in a form of conversational Greek. And Arian says, and here he's describing the discourses, but it gives us a sense of what he's trying to achieve in the handbook as well. Is that he wanted to capture how Epictetus spoke, and he wanted to capture it wants to give like a live impression of what his lessons were like with his students in the Acropolis. And Arian says, whatever I heard him say, I used to write down word for word as best I could, endeavouring to preserve it as a memorial for my own future use of his way of thinking and the frankness of his speech. Now, there's sometimes a question mark then about whether Arian is just simply putting his own words in Epictetus's mouth. We'll think of this with Socrates and Plato. Socrates doesn't write anything down, as far as we know, and instead Socrates appears in virtually all of Plato's dialogues. And then we don't know, if it's Socrates really speaking, or if it's Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his ideas, blah, blah, blah. But Arian, who ends up becoming a major historian later on, writes in a much more kind of floral style. And so the kind of the tone and the manner and even the ideas of the discourses and the handbook are kind of different. So in case you're thinking, it's really this guy, it's not Epictetus. Well, the critical consensus is it kind of is Epictetus, and probably Epictetus was actually involved in the writing of these books. Maybe he can, like, if he didn't, see editorial proofs or something like this, then he may have kind of co-written it in some way with Arian. We just don't know. Now let's think about the key argument here. This is the thing that I really want us to discuss when we meet again on Monday. So what is it ultimately that Epictetus is trying to tell us? What does he want us to do with his teachings, which are kind of preserved in a handbook for people to carry around and read for reference, with memorable sayings that we must keep in mind at any point? Well, and it begins very firmly on this. It's a very strong beginning as a book. We've got to identify what is up to us. What is up to us and what is not up to us. What is within our power and what isn't within our power. That's what we've got to do. And what is what is up to us and what is in our power is what is within. It's our thoughts, and it's the kind of various categories of thoughts, ideas that he sets out. We need to understand these because we have some control over these. We are not just the passive victims of fate. We do have a kind of agency, and that is in understanding what is up to us. And this is so important. I'm going to throw a Greek term at you, which I'm going to completely garble the pronunciation of. Prohairesis. Number 2. This is classic Stoic doctrine, isn't it? You will remember this from previous weeks, that the big thing is living in accordance with nature. Epictetus says that we should keep our will in harmony with nature. Keep our will. So I guess living and will, what's the difference? Well, this kind of emphasis on will is kind of telling us that for Epictetus, there is something that we can control. Will is something we can decide to do one thing over another. We can choose to follow some impressions over other impressions. We need to control our will. We need to kind of exercise our will. We need to develop our will. We need to train it. And this is within our power, keeping our will in harmony with nature. Freedom thereby follows. Because remember, for Epictetus, this is philosophy as a way of life. It's not a way of thinking. It's not, at least in the stuff that we're looking at, he's got very little to say about the topoi, which you will remember of the Stoics. Physics and logic. Doesn't seem to be that interested in that. Even Seneca wrote a book on natural questions. Epictetus. He'll study others. And maybe that's an important thing too. That one thing that makes Epictetus stand out is that he's not always an original thinker, but he's very good at teaching previous Stoics ideas, and he teaches them in an incredibly engaging way. Now, if we identify what is up to us and what is not, and if we keep our will in harmony with nature, and if we live in accordance with nature, if we kind of pursue a kind of a frugal life informed by philosophy, then we will achieve a state of freedom. Now, garble Greek is now going to follow, eleutheria. There is a state of freedom that we can enjoy. It's a freedom as opposed to slavery, and Epictetus plays on this freedom of slavery quite a bit, of the mind. What does that mean? And why speak of that kind of freedom in the context of a highly hierarchical slave-owning society in which you yourself are a former slave, who may have a lifelong disability caused by being abused and beaten as a slave? We don't know that, but it's possible, isn't it? So what does that freedom mean? We're going to get to that. Okay, let's get to this first bit. What is up to us? Now, let's just start at the very beginning, and let's just kind of hover over this first bit, because when you're reading something new, there's sometimes can be a tendency just to kind of gloss over the first bits in order to kind of develop an understanding. But the key stuff is right here, folks. So he tells us, some things in the world are up to us, while others are not. Up to us are our faculties of judgment, motivation, desire, and aversion. In short, everything that is our own doing. So what is up to us are it's within the mind. It's things that we can control, things that are what we think about certain things, and what motivates us to do certain things, or even act on certain ideas. Now, what belongs to us is our own mind. That's where our freedom lies. But what our freedom does not consist of, is the body. Not up to us are our body, our property, our reputations, and our official positions. In short, everything that is not our own doing. So here is where freedom lies. Freedom of the mind. A freedom that isn't enchanted by what earlier Greek Stoics called indifference, like health or wealth. Said there's something that we need to cultivate so that we can live well, and that's our minds. Now, this really matters, this discovery of what is up to us, because if we know what's up to us, then we are not going to get upset and heartbroken over things that are just beyond our control ultimately. If we can understand what is up to us, then we are not going to be here, as he says here, pained and troubled. We're not going to blame other people. We're not going to blame ourselves. We're not going to blame the gods. Epictetus says further that once we've got this knowledge, quote, nothing harmful will happen to you. And again, we might hear the echo of Socrates here, that a good man cannot be harmed. That there is some kind of, there is a chamber, Marcus Aurelius called it, a citadel within, that ultimately cannot be touched by the arrows of fortune if we protect it. If we keep some center of ourself. Now, what does that really mean? Let's see how Epictetus develops this argument. Now, one thing that makes his approach kind of refreshing, but we've had this a bit with Seneca too, is this real focus on what Roman life is like, and he gives lots of everyday Roman examples, which would have been, really memorable and interesting for his students. And one of them is going to the bathhouse. Going to the bath. This is bath now, and having to deal with a place that is, really noisy. It's really busy. People might mess around with your stuff. Your things might get stolen. Here we've just got these tourists. This is a pre-coronavirus image, of course. But we can imagine visiting a tourist attraction on a very busy day, and there's huge queues, and people are walking really slowly, and they're taking pictures of absolutely everything, and it's driving us up the wall. Ugh. Now, what Epictetus says is that it is occasions like this that we need to remember some of the kind of key tenets of Stoic philosophy. Now, this comes under prohairesis, of keeping our will in harmony with nature. That is not like on a good sunny day when everything is going well that we really can understand and live our philosophy, our philosophical understanding, is when a shit hits the fan. It's in times of adversity, not just always noble ones, just ones where you're just getting a bit annoyed about something. It's when things are not as we want, that we need above all to keep our will in harmony with nature. Our will in harmony with nature. Now, just before we drill into that, we want to keep in mind the Stoic view of nature, that the universe is ultimately harmonious, that the universe is intelligible to right reason, to human reason. That what animates the cosmos is a kind of fire, a pneuma, but it's a pneuma that isn't one that we just imagine a kind of naked and aggressive violence and destruction and conflict. But it's a kind of fire of creativity in which, to use a phrase that came up in one of the discussions a few weeks ago, there is this cosmic interdependence. Everything's pervaded by logos, by reason. Keeping our will in harmony with nature then is to accept other people's shortcomings and accept your own, and to not perpetuate your own shortcomings or other people's shortcomings by getting cross or angry about something. To not get angry. Now, there's two stages if we're going to not get angry in the bathhouse. You might be thinking first world problems, in the first century. Yes, it is, but, Epictetus knows his audience. So what are the two things that we can do to keep our will in harmony with nature? Well, the first one, Epictetus says, is we need to manage our impressions. Now, impressions, what does that mean? So there is a corresponding Greek word, which I'm going to garble the pronunciation of, is phantasiae. Now you might be thinking, that's fantasies, isn't it? But it's not like the English word fantasy would be almost like kind of seductive mental fictions, or the narratives that our desires take the shape of. But here it's much broader, like phantasiae, impressions. Sometimes it's translated as appearances. We can imagine mental impressions, mental appearances, stuff that runs through our mind. Basically, we need to manage it. We need to train it. We need to acquire some discipline over the stuff that kind of plays in the front of our minds. Now, part of that comes back to one of the three things that I emphasize as the three parts of the process of Stoic thinking, of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge means understanding the origin, the basis of your own mind's impressions, of the things that you think about, of what causes them, of what causes the feelings that you feel, of what causes your passions. Now, we might expect here a kind of science of the passions. We seem to get something like that when we were looking at Greek Stoic philosophy in Cicero and in Diogenes Laertius, but there isn't anything like that here in Epictetus, at least not in the Handbook. Instead, what Epictetus seems to really emphasize as part of our way of managing our impressions is to kind of often think about and thereby establish the view that things won't go as you want them to, that adversity is inevitable, that suffering is inevitable, and that above all we must not hope, we must not fall victim to delusions, to wild hopes. We need to instead see things as they are, not as we would like them to be. To deal with human beings as they are, not as we would like them to be. Which, that last bit there, is from Spinoza's Political Treatise. It's a quote from that. It's one of the ways in which Stoic philosophy really permeates an early modern realist perspective that we'll look at in a few weeks. Epictetus says, "Don't ask for things to happen as you would like them to, but wish them to happen as they actually do, and you will be all right." And you will be all right. Well, that sounds great, doesn't it? What's involved in that? Well, the training involved in this is something that we'll get to in a moment. Let's land on another kind of major bit of what Epictetus is selling, and this is often one of the bits that is most often quoted, and it's about our judgments. It was there. in my failed efforts to teach my little one to be a Stoic himself. There's lots of different translations of what I'm about to give you. You might have heard a couple of different variants already. It is not things themselves that trouble people, but their opinions about things. This is sometimes translated, but their judgments about things. And this kind of quote has many lives. Get it in Shakespeare's Hamlet, where he says in Act 2 or somewhere like this, that there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. John Milton. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. A bit of Blake's Milton as well. William Blake would say that John Milton was on the side of the devil in terms of the poetry that he wrote and that he was trying to achieve. Now, Blake meant that as a kind of as a compliment, really, that there was something within the devil, which is on the side of creativity. Nietzsche would call this the Dionysian of what is transgressive, of the new. But these places, heaven and hell, are psychological places, places of the mind, different extremes, Blake would say. The Earl of Shaftesbury, not so well known in English-speaking philosophy, even though he was an English philosopher in the 17th century, calls this, what we're talking about judgments, he calls it the sovereign principle of Stoicism, that we need to separate judgments from events themselves. Not the things themselves, but our opinions about things. That's what we can work on. Our opinions, our judgments. That's within our power. Now, it will be interesting to kind of get into a lot of depth about this in our discussions, because it's this insight which also then becomes a key basis for some of the psychotherapy that's developed, that uses the Stoics. It's this in particular. Let's see what else Epictetus says about it. No, okay, stuff. That has a bearing then when we think about something like death, when we think about losing the people that we love in different ways. The problem isn't death itself. Sometimes death might be construed in different ways as a good thing. It's one of those indifference that we might remember from earlier. Death itself might be a bad thing. The problem is when we hold the opinion, bear in mind it can be translated to judgment, we hold a judgment that death is terrible, that death is untimely, that we did not expect to die, and therefore we die in a state of great distress and shock. We might want to keep in mind here that what our Stoics who often emphasize and gets in Seneca too is the importance of learning how to die. But in other words, Socrates' philosophy is a training for dying. Part of this then becomes the reason for the emphasis on premeditating on future evils. Now, what Epictetus does when he's thinking about what is up to us is this regular insistence on avoiding blaming people. We don't want to blame others. We don't even want to blame ourselves. Now, when it comes to our opinion about death, if it's good or bad or whatever, that's our opinion. So that's what is up to us, and that's what we are responsible for, and that's what we can manage. So if we are distressed about something, we shouldn't blame, could be the fatalistic bit, we shouldn't blame others for causing the distress. We need to work on the distress that is within us, the judgment, the opinion that causes this distress. We need to avoid blame. Blame is a bad thing. We see this in a couple of points in the handbook. Uneducated people blame others. Though novices blame themselves. A fully educated person blames no one, neither himself nor anyone else. So to live without blame, because ultimately what does blame achieve? Does blame make you a better person ethically? Does it make the world a better place to blame others? Or maybe without blame we won't achieve justice. Or maybe in a society in which you have grown up as a slave and in which there is no prospects of the abolition of slavery, why distress your mind with things that are completely beyond its power? Why not work on what is within your power, which is the impressions, in that you achieve a kind of temporary but real freedom? That's what's at stake here. This is what we'll come back to later. This also has an interesting bearing on clairvoyancy. Now, we know in Greek society and in Roman society, these are polytheistic societies. People would consult fortune tellers, soothsayers. In Rome, people that would read the entrails, look at the entrails of birds, and make judgments about what was going to happen. Nowadays, well, we're no longer cutting birds open, but we have other things too. These are some images from various fortune-telling things. Now, Epictetus is addressing the need to know your fortune in parts of the handbook. And ultimately, he says we shouldn't trust our happiness, our motivations on the fortune teller. We should trust it on ourselves. Because what we're aiming for is, and if we're trying to think here, right, what ultimately is the gain if we follow Epictetus' philosophy? Well, it's tranquility of mind. That's what we're going to get. Epictetus says, quote, "It is better to starve to death in a calm and confident state of mind than to live anxiously amidst abundance." And we can see that as a comment on Seneca's life. What does tranquility get for us? We're going to become Epictetians. That's the thing. What is tranquility is going to give us autonomy. It's going to give us freedom. Not just freedom from anxiety, although that is really important. This goes back to the word apatheia, which is what the Stoics are said to strive for. Apatheia, the absence of negative emotions, I guess, the absence of sad passions. Now, if we can achieve this autonomy, well, if we can achieve this tranquility of mind, we're going to be free to kind of recognize things for what they are, not as we would like them to be. And we are going to be able to make ourselves the agent of the things that happen to us, even if we cannot change the core facts of an adverse situation. Something terrible that might happen to them. We might lose a loved one. We might get a terrible medical diagnosis, or a bad accident might happen to us. It's not. Epictetus doesn't want us to live in a state of delusion, like this stuff never happened. Rather, it's about how the mind responds, and maybe overcomes without forgetting these events. There's a couple of powerful bits in the handbook where he makes this emphasis on what we can do. "But to myself, all predictions are favourable if I wish them to be, since it is up to me to benefit from the outcome, whatever it may be." In response to the fortune teller, anything is good, even if having your tarot cards read and you get death reversed or something. Anything is favourable if you do something constructive with it. The goal is not to attain high office, public office, but to be mentally free. To be mentally free, he says, is to despise the things that are not up to us. Now we're going back in a circle, aren't we? What is up to us and what is not. Let's see if we can get a bit further on this by thinking about the training that we would get if we came to Epictetus' school. Right. One thing that makes our Stoics quite good is their taste for analogies. So Seneca talks about Stoic philosophy as a form of wrestling. Now, a good wrestler needs to have good opponents, otherwise he's going to get flabby and weak. He needs powerful bodies to wrestle against so that he can, or she can exercise their strength, become stronger, become more agile, become a more kind of powerful combatant. I'm being vague here, aren't I? But the goal, Seneca's point is that you shouldn't think that, you shouldn't pity yourself because bad stuff happens to you. In fact, you should turn it on its head and see it as something constructive, because it's going to make you stronger, because you're going to withstand things that many people wouldn't be able to withstand. And you're not going to take refuge in superstitions or by kind of delusions, pretending that's not going to happen. You're going to see things for what they are. And you're going to develop and fortify a powerful mind that can then go on to withstand even worse adversity. That's the goal. That's part of the training. Now, we should keep in mind here this wrestling aspect of the school in Nicopolis. what little we know about how the school worked is that, in the morning, the students are studying existing Stoic philosophy like Chrysippus, like Zeno, like Cleanthes and others. But then in the afternoon, there is this kind of emphasis on argumentation and on putting this philosophy into practice in a much more everyday way. Epictetus doesn't want his students just to be good scholars who can recite the right bit of Zeno. He wants to heal them. He wants to heal the soul. And this idea of Stoic philosophy being a kind of medicine for the body does come up largely actually in Epictetus. Epictetus says, quote, "It is more necessary for the soul to be cured than the body, for it is better to die than to live badly." In the discourses, he describes his school as like a hospital. Quote, "The philosopher's school is a doctor's clinic." So we might want to think here, what kind of treatments is the doctor prescribing, and what is the net goal at the end? Well, there is that whole feature of the handbook, which is that it's written in this very kind of frank and direct way, in this very conversational way. That it's dishing out useful tidbits of wisdom that we can apply to our own lives. One of them relates to something that came up in the discussions of Seneca last week in person, but not really in the lecture, which is self-admonition, self-interrogation, something that Seneca encourages in his letters to Lucilius. But we didn't really look at this. And you get this in Epictetus as well. This comes up quite early in the handbook. It's this kind of instruction about what you should do. He says, "Right now, then, make it your habit to tell every jarring thought or impression you are just an appearance and in no way the real thing. Next, examine it and test it by these rules that you have. First and foremost, does it involve the things up to us or the things not up to us?" You're seeing a theme, aren't you? "And if it involves one of the things not up to us, have the following response to hand. Not my business. Doesn't matter." So this careful checking and reflection, meditating we might call it later on what we think and what is worrying us and what is bothering us is key to Epictetan practice. To think about the things that we're stressing about. Is it up to us or not? Do we have any real kind of control or influence over it? Maybe we don't. If we don't, not my business. Doesn't matter. Now I want you to think back here to the comics at the very beginning about the relationship with vice, because this is one of the more memorable, and it's interesting that Arian repeats this quite a lot in the handbook. Bear in mind that he is involved as the compiler, so he kind of, we get a sense of his interest in Epictetus' philosophy, and the stuff that he seems to really jot down a lot is that the things in your life are going to die. You're going to lose them, and what you must do is cultivate not necessarily coldness, but certainly detachment from the things that you love. Now this comes up quite early on in the analogy of a jug that you might love. Epictetus says, "If you are fond of a jug, say, 'I am fond of a jug.' Then, if it is broken, you will not be troubled. When you kiss your little child or your wife, say that you are kissing a human being. Then, if one of them dies, you will not be troubled." That's the thing. Is it as easy as that? Can we just give ourselves these nuggets of wisdom, and then we won't feel pain, or when we lose something we love? Well, there's nothing guaranteed about that at all. In case you're wondering that this is especially cold, we want to keep in mind here how common infant mortality was in this period. Losing your child or losing your wife is probably something that might well happen to you. And how do you respond without total heartbreak? How do you respond without blaming the gods? Well, again, we know that Epictetus is telling us not to blame. And so we get this in other points later. And he brings up this image of returning something that somebody has given to you, but that is not yours to keep, and therefore you must give it back. He says, never say about anything I've lost it, but say I have returned it. Has your little child died? It's been returned. Has your wife died? She's been returned. Returned to what? Of course, there's a question here about what the gods mean or what we are returning to, but it goes back to the Stoic belief that there is this intrinsic harmony and reason to the universe. It may not be human-centered or human-shaped. Nonetheless, there is something about nature which bears an intrinsic harmony or symmetry to itself. We need to understand that. We need to understand that what we love cannot last forever, cannot be immortal. Epictetus, one thing that makes his kind of philosophy quite interesting is that he offers these quite memorable ways for us to put this into practice. And then one way that he does, and I think this is quite a good way, is that we think about what happens when other people lose things that they value and they love. What happens when we see that somebody has lost something that they really like? We just say that they have lost it. You know, it's bad for them, but that's it. Or when like a friend, not a close friend, but someone that we know loses something really important to them. It's very sad, but it's ultimately, we can understand it as loss, as you know, that we all lose people. So Epictetus says we need to try and cultivate that detachment when it comes to people in our own lives too. That's really hard. And there's that thin line between it becoming a kind of coldness, and I don't know where we're going to sit on this. We get this in this bit 16. When we view others who grieve, Epictetus says, 16, once have the following thought available. What is crushing these people is not the event, since there are other people it does not crush, but their opinion about it. Remember, opinion, judgment is interchangeable, but it's this issue all the same. Their opinion about it. Is that ultimately what matters, what counts? We'll get back to this when we talk about fatalism later on. Of course, all of this kind of, remember death has a huge influence in early modern culture, and this is why we're going to spend a couple of weeks on this in a few weeks' time. In the image in vanitas imagery, usually from the Netherlands, where you get, these kind of sumptuous images of life's pleasures, but also their transience. Music, the gaiety of life, money and gold, things that are here but then pass. And then the skull, usually somewhere that's not meant to be conspicuous, but is very conspicuous. See it in this image too. The flowers, life's beauty doesn't last long. Of course, it's interesting that these appear in Calvinist societies. There's almost kind of seatbelts on not enjoying yourself too much in the Dutch Golden Age. Remember that you are mortal. Maybe we could make the link here, and we'll make this link a lot more in a few weeks' time. It's interesting that Stoic philosophy really speaks to societies that are wealthy, basically. That this kind of ethics, psychology-driven Stoic thinking of the Roman world, by and for the Roman upper class, ends up being rediscovered in early modern Europe, in the wealthy Netherlands and wealthy England. And then Stoicism so this is the 17th century, and Stoicism also is very influential and important thereafter, in the 19th century, in Victorian England. What does that mean? What's the politics of that? Let's think about some of the learning tools off the school at Nicopolis. So one thing that we came across last week with Seneca was the importance of premeditating on future evils, on bad stuff that is going to happen. So thinking about losing people that you love, thinking about adversity, thinking about misfortune in different ways. Epictetus, remember, his skill sometimes maybe is not as originator of thought, but as a teacher of other people's thinking, says, set before your eyes every day death and exile, and everything else that looks terrible, especially death. Then you will never have any mean thought or be too keen on anything. You don't want to be too keen on anything. There's a whole thing about character advice that we're going to get to in a second. It comes up later in Handbook, which it's interesting. Maybe there's something else almost slightly comical about it. We don't want to be too keen on anything. We don't want to. Well, let's put this in the more charitable way. We don't want to get too attached to things that we cannot control and hold on to. Sometimes this can have quite a poetic flourish. This is from the Discourses, and it's about exile and death. And again, we don't know for sure, but it's interesting to think about whether Epictetus is meditating on what happened to Seneca, who died, who kind of died, in the decades before, or during the time he's a teacher, I guess. So Epictetus says, and this quote is from the Discourses, so it's not something that you'll have read yet. I'll just read it here. An exile. So what about exile? Quote, wherever I go, I will be fine, because I was already fine here. Not on account of the place, but as a result of my principles, and I am going to take them with me. No one can take them away from me. They are my only possessions. Irremovable ones that are enough for me wherever I am and whatever I do. But it's now time for you to die. Why do you say to die? Don't make it into a tragic business. Tell it as it is. It's now time for the material you are made of to return to the source it first came from. What's terrible about that? It's almost kind of reminiscent of the way that the tide comes in and out, of a cyclical view of nature and of life. One that, even though Epictetus is around the time after Jesus Christ, is different to any sense of life and afterlife, life and resurrection. Life comes and goes. There is generation and there's destruction. And all of these things are present at the same time. As much as it pains us to lose what we love, we mustn't mourn it too bitterly for all our lives, because these are things that are themselves part of the wider image of nature. Again, there's a whole difference, isn't there, between saying these things and living and thinking these things. Maybe we'll come back to this more as we go along. So there's this whole question here too about Epictetus' relationship to Seneca. I don't really want to say that much more about that because I'm not really sure. But one where we saw this last week in On the Shortness of Life, that Seneca, is telling his father-in-law Paulinus, please retire, don't look after the grain in Rome, the goal, you should be studying philosophy. That's going to make you a much better person. You can live with the dead, But Epictetus is more funny and I think more realistic about the misery of the philosopher. That actually, if you choose philosophy, is he right? I don't know. I don't think he's wrong. I'll put it that way. Epictetus says, then you'll be mocked, you'll be poor, you'll work hard, and you'll have no friends. Quote, you're going to have to go without sleep, work really hard, stay away from friends and family, be disrespected by a young slave, get mocked by people in the street, and come off worse in rank, office, or courtroom. Everywhere, in fact. Think about all this, and then see whether you want to exchange it for calm, freedom, and tranquility. Well, we know where Epictetus is going. Of course we want tranquility. Of course we don't want to experience fear and hatred and anxiety and stuff like this. But it's very much against the grain of the ambition-driven, ostentatious wealth and splendor of Roman society. And we don't really know how many people adhered to it. Arian certainly loved that stuff. We don't know if everyone did. Of course, it all conforms to this image of the philosopher, the male philosopher, as somebody who is cool and detached, as somebody who must suffer for their art. And I don't quite know what we do about that. I still don't think we've said enough yet about Stoicism and masculinity. I think we're just going to have to try and we need to cover this at some point. Anyway, I thought we could just look briefly at some of the some of the interesting character advice that Epictetus gives to the would-be philosopher. Now, these are things that come up towards the end of the handbook, and they're kind of like personality things, really, things like character traits that you should avoid. Now, you can probably think of some already. We could think here about What would be the gain to your life if you live these things? So Epictetus recommends, number 1, quote, stay mainly silent. Avoid trite topics like gladiators or horse races or athletes or food or drink. Don't talk critically or flatteringly or judgmentally about people. Don't laugh much or often. Now, you're not going to want to go to dinner parties except for those that are in your circle. You're going to want to cut out all luxury. Have only the most basic food, drink, clothing, housing, servants. Again, when we hear this stuff, we want to think about the society in which it emerges, in which it comes in. Wealth, splendor, hierarchy, violence, reverence for material things. But then there are other things like the don't laugh, that be silent stuff, which maybe more reflect the, I don't know what we'd call it, a kind of spiritual parsimony, maybe miserliness, that we saw much earlier in Xenocytium, who's described as misanthropic and avoids other people. Epictetus says of sex, abstain as far as possible before marriage, and if you do go in for it, do nothing that is socially unacceptable. When it comes to sports, let's say we've come to a gladiatorial contest, don't support any side except that one which is going to win, and whatever you do, don't get excited at the game. In conversation, don't try to be funny, because that will lapse into vulgarity and lewdness. Maybe this is a good tip. Sometimes don't go on about yourself too much. Don't go on about your own deeds and adventures. Often people will find that quite boring to listen to, but he's already advised to be quiet. Now, there are a couple of bits of the character advice which are more interesting and which have reflect kind of Stoic tenets in them. One of these is quite memorable, and John Sellers talks about this idea that if somebody criticizes you, you agree with them because they've helped you learn something about yourself. Epictetus says, quote, obviously he didn't know my other thoughts, or he would have mentioned them as well. If somebody criticizes you, well, it depends on what they're saying. If it's kind of based in reality in some way, then we should be grateful that they will help us work out our flaws so that we can work on them in the training, in the gym of philosophy. Epictetus also says that we should keep in mind his idol, Socrates. We should live like Socrates, and we should think in many situations. He gives an example: when you meet somebody important, ask yourself what Socrates would do and follow that. What would Socrates do? It's an interesting way to live. Now, this is just a vase, but it's got some runners on it. And maybe this goes back to the thing that we get towards the very end of the handbook. Like, what is all this exercise for? What's all this training for? Ascesis. What's all that training for? What's it going to achieve for us? It's going to make us strong. But it's not about trying to get us to an end point. You might want to think of something separate. The analogy of the archer. That it's not, training in archery isn't just about, the goal isn't just to hit a certain target. The goal is to be good at archery. It's a trade, it's a craft, it's a skill. Arete, virtue. In Greek, arete means skill. You train and you become excellent at it. But Epictetus adds another dimension to this. That as you train, you're not training for an event that's going to be in 2 years' time. You're training for today. And today is the day that you put this stuff into practice. Today is the Olympic Games. You might have read this already about the analogy of the Olympic Games. I think it's a great one. Don't wait to become a noble person, a generous person tomorrow. Don't wait for a certain moment. Do it right now. Well, maybe not right now because you listen to this, but do it at some point today. Epictetus says, quote, and whatever you encounter that is painful or pleasant or popular or unpopular, keep in mind that now is the contest. And here, right now, are the Olympic Games. And that postponement is no longer an option, and that your progress is saved or ruined by a single day and a single action. This is reminiscent of the stuff I use James Dean. as a way of thinking about this last week with Seneca. That we live as though you'll die today. Today, time in which you're mindfully present is what really counts. Use it. As Epictetus says, like Socrates. Perfect yourself, applying your reason to whatever you encounter. Because this is a way of life. This isn't just some abstract study. This is what really counts. Okay, so that's our grounding in Epictetus's teachings. We're now going to look at this question about whether it doesn't get us anywhere. Whether we could almost call it, let's call it the George Floyd problem. What does the Stoic do about injustice? So we could try and pitch this as a question, just so we know where we're getting at. And this is something that I want us to discuss when we next meet virtually. What are the social and political consequences of adhering to the philosophy of Epictetus? Now, before I continue rambling away, you might want to pause it here and just think to yourself, what do you think about that question? Maybe just mentally think to yourself a couple of points. What are the consequences of all this? What does it mean to be a Stoic according to Epictetus? What would be the consequences? Now, last week when we were looking at Seneca, we were thinking about Roman life and life in the Roman Empire. Now, it hadn't always been an empire, it had been a republic. And a lot of the republican ideas and values that will animate particularly the American Revolution, actually the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution of the 17th and 18th century, the Enlightenment, a lot of that republicanism derives from Roman times, from the Roman Republic. Now, the Republic had degenerated into strongman tyranny of different sorts under people like Caligula and Nero. There were slave uprisings. Actually, there was a Spartacus' slave uprising is during the time of the Republic. And these uprisings are suppressed. Now, what does Epictetus think about slavery? Maybe we'll use that as a way of getting into the George Floyd question. What does he say about slavery? What does he think we can do about slavery? Especially given that he was a slave and his name is acquired property, literally. Well, this is where we might all disagree, I'm not sure. But there's something radical about what he does with freedom and slavery, which is kind of going in the Stoic direction already established, but he kind of makes even more of it than what it had been. That freedom and slavery aren't what you think they are. They're not legal properties. They're not about whether you can move somewhere, whether you've got a right to the city or a right to vote or take part in public office or not. Freedom is a condition, is a condition of the mind. It's a condition of the mind that involves self-sufficiency, self-control, a kind of mental discipline. And therefore, the slave can be somebody who is very wealthy, could even be the Roman emperor. And the freed man, the most free person of all, could be the slave who serves him. Now, it's a bit of a long leap, but those of you that know Hegel, you might want to keep in mind here Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and the master-slave conflict, lord-bondsman conflict relation, the fight to the death there, and the way in which, according to Hegel, the slave wins ultimately and becomes free. So in case you don't know, Hegel says that there is this kind of formative moment in our collective consciousness in culture in which two people desire recognition from the other of their own status and who they are. They want to be seen and recognized. But in order to be recognized, this ends up becoming a conflict, a fight for supremacy, a fight that ultimately is a fight to the death. In order to be adequately and fully recognized, one must squash and crush the other. But one side doesn't want to die, maybe because they're already weaker in the first place, we don't know. They decide that they are going to choose life and that they're going to serve the other, they're going to recognize the other as a slave. As a result, the one who has kind of braved it all, has played chicken and not flinched, becomes the master. And they are recognized as served by the slave, but they're not served by their equal. Further, in Hegel's view, the master ends up becoming unproductive. Let's think of our Middle Ages knights or something, or aristocrats. They're not working, they're not producing, they're not developing anything culturally or anything like this. They're just feasting and fighting. Feasting, fighting, and fucking. Whereas the slave, at least in a romanticized way that Hegel imagines, the slave is forced to look within for a kind of freedom. Because they're not free to move in their bodies, because they are not afforded any dignity and respect in their living situation, they discover and they exercise that dignity and ability in their ability to fashion objects that might at first be for the service of the master, but end up taking on artistic and creative value. That it is the slaves thinking through and thinking beyond and thinking out of the situation of slavery that becomes the most creative and empowering moment, and ultimately makes the slave more powerful than the master. You might be going, ugh. But I think Epictetus is trying to say something really important here, and it has a whole bearing on what we assume freedom to be: freedom of the mind and not a freedom of the body. Freedom, which is a kind of escape, isn't? It's a freedom. When Nietzsche talks about a slave morality, he's talking about Christianity, but we really want to keep in mind Epictetus here, a slave's morality, someone who is literally reversing and overturning the values of the masters and saying that the masters are in fact the slaves. And the slaves who can develop this power of self-sufficiency and strength in thinking become the masters. Let's look at what Epictetus is saying, so we can kind of ground this a bit. Let's look at a quote from the Handbook. Our master is anyone who has the power to implement or prevent the things that we want or don't want. Whoever wants to be free, therefore, should wish for nothing or avoid nothing that is up to other people. Failing that, one is bound to be a slave. So it's that up to us and not up to us thing. So the freedom then is something that is inner and not outer. It's about recognizing and acting on and understanding what is up to us, our desires, judgments, motivations, and so forth. It's that mental discipline, mental fitness. Now, in case you might be thinking here, well, this is still just going to lead to a kind of resignation. If we have mentally agile slaves, but ultimately they're still slaves, then what does that do for the social order? What do we do if people just rationalize and reason away the existence of terrible injustices and inequities? Well, I'm not sure, and I'm not going to... You will need to work the answer out for this. I'm not sure. Let's just put in mind here some of the strengths of Stoicism as a kind of political resistance, and then we might be able to see how Epictetus responds to the problem of structural injustice. So I mentioned last week that a lot of key figures in the Roman Republic, including those who assassinate Julius Caesar in order to stop him becoming the first emperor, are Stoics in some form. Brutus, in particular, Brutus's wife, Portia Catonis. These are people that are living Stoic thinking. Cato the Younger, and another important figure in protecting the Roman Republic and championing free speech. They live a kind of Stoicism here. Cato the Younger. I think this is Brutus. To be honest, I can't quite remember. And these are some more of our female Stoics from last week. Now, when we looked at female Stoic philosophers last week, we talked about their relationship to men and how they're defined by that. Now, in particular, the relationship, with the exception of, I think it's Fannia. I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? Marcus Aurelius' daughter. Most of them are married or related to Roman republicans in different ways. And I mentioned too that in Rome, even in the time of Nero, there's this kind of Stoic resistance, Stoic opposition. Why? What would it, if this is a philosophy that is just about passive and meek acceptance of things as they are, then why would so many Stoics be attached to a form of politics which emphasizes opposition and resistance. Well, maybe it comes back to what Stoic philosophy is trying to encourage: a sense of duty to the community, acting for the common good, looking at all human beings as equal by nature, even if you don't really practice that much. It's the problem of James Madison that was mentioned in the discussions last week. But then it's also an opposition to the superstitious symbols of Roman imperial power, especially when the emperors were deified themselves and became like gods. This is smashing the idols. This is viewing things as they are. I guess the deeper question is, does accepting things as they are result in quietism? Does it result in you just deciding not to do anything about them? Maybe with Epictetus there is a bit more of that there. Let's look at some instances of this. Again, there's a question mark over it. Is this just Roman culture? So he gives this example of somebody who's got like an abusive father who's quite violent and cruel. And Epictetus says, well, you've got a natural affinity to your father. Doesn't matter if they're good or not. You should still, be a good daughter or son, even if they're violent and mistreat you. Now we wouldn't accept that nowadays, but that's different cultural ideas. But it could be a negative way of reading the next thing. No one else, in fact, will harm you without your consent. You will be harmed only when you think you are being harmed. So we think of that in terms of horrific violence from police. What should oppressed communities do when they are regularly harmed? Is there something here about us almost consenting in that harm if we believe it really harms us? Well, maybe in that sense, all of this philosophy is kind of teaching, it's kind of pushing to a kind of withdrawal, even a kind of communal withdrawal, the finding strength within features of communal life, I don't know, like churches and so on, which are away from this violence and which provide a kind of strength or tranquil refuge away from it. But I guess the problem of refuges is that they're dangerous if they allow an unjust situation to just perpetuate indefinitely. There are other things where Epictetus is on the side of accepting the social order. There's no doubt about it. And it comes in a right way. He's talking about how we should revere the gods. Now, really, well, we did see this a bit with in Diogenes Laertius's Digest. But really, if you are looking at nature and you're looking at God as something that exists materially in nature, then you're not going to. The Roman polytheistic gods are bullshit. So you shouldn't revere them. But the Stoics tell us, and Epictetus tells us, we should worship our gods. He says, quote, "The essence of reverence concerning the gods is first, to hold correct beliefs concerning their existence and their fine and just administration of the universe. And second, to position yourself to obey them and accept whatever happens, complying with it willingly on the understanding that what comes to pass has been ordained by their most excellent decision." Okay, two ways of reading that. Is that just okay? What the Roman citizens worship, the Temple of Saturn, whatever you. This is great. We must understand the doctrines and just accept them. Or maybe there's something a bit more subtle here. This is a bit far-fetched, but I've got in mind Spinoza here, because Spinoza talks a lot about God, and sometimes Spinoza's readers say, "Nah, he's just a materialist. He doesn't really believe in the Christian or Jewish God. He just uses God to kind of conceal what he really thinks." But I don't accept that. I think Spinoza does have a view of who God is, and I think Epictetus also imagines the gods as certainly not personalities that exist on the outside of the system, but he believes that the gods kind of represent this harmony that he's trying to have us put our wills in accordance with in different ways. But there's still elements that are different. To accept whatever happens, we're going to accept whatever happens. Then we're not going to be, making all sorts of tributes to the gods in order for them to intercede on our behalf. They're not going to do that because they're not that kind of way. They're not those kind of gods. Those sorts of gods don't exist. We just accept what comes. Now, if we're going to think of Epictetus in a radical way, I won't sell this too much. Again, keep in mind here, the Greco-Roman world, it's very superstitious. There are all these, deities. They are cruel. They intervene in human life. It comes the annals of human history are kind of part myth, part some kind of reality, we could say. Now, Epictetus, if he's telling us to respect the social order, he's not trying to provide, more ammunition for it. He's saying that exists over there and don't overthrow it. Work on yourself. Undertake the training. Undertake the gym exercise so that you can be in the Olympic Games. Understand nature as it is, not in terms of mythic beings, but as your relation to what happens around you. And from that, you can cultivate a way of life and a disposition in which you will not be harmed, and in which you will live well, and in which you will be free. Oh, okay, just a final thing, and then we're going to start wrapping up. Now, this is something that comes up briefly in the handbook, but it then appears later in the discourses, and I think it's a nice distinction. It's something that Epictetus wants to, it's a contrast that Epictetus wants to draw between understanding the letter of philosophy and living it in your life. And so we could say it's a difference between being a philosopher or being a grammarian or being like a literary scholar. Like the philosopher doesn't just learn other people's teachings, doesn't just learn what Seneca said or Epictetus said or Marcus Aurelius said. The true philosopher uses it to change and reflect on and change their life, to live in a different way, which might mean that you don't need to be Epictetian or whatever at all. You could be anti-Epictetus, anti a lot of what he says, but the important thing is that you live differently in accordance with your ideas. Now, this comes up in a moment in the discourses where Epictetus presents his own thinking, and then he kind of mocks where most people get their thinking from. Some things are good, some bad, some indifferent. The good things are virtues and what participates in them. The bad things are vices and what participates in them, and the indifferents are those in between, such as wealth, health, life, death, pleasure, and pain. It's exactly the sort of stuff that were with Diogenes Laertius a few weeks ago. Epictetus continues. Oh, where did you learn that? Helenacus says it in his Egyptian tales. Now, this is like pure Zeno, basically. This isn't the Egyptian tales. That's like some, this is, that's like, it'd be like somebody giving a summary of Nietzsche's philosophy and saying that's in Lord of the Rings, or J.K. Rowling says this in one of the Harry Potter books. Epictetus. But how is it any better to say this Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, than to say that Diogenes said it in his Ethics, or Chrysippus, or Cleanthes? Have you put any of these things to the test and come to your own view? Maybe it's something that we can do with Epictetus, putting something to the test, wrestling with it, exercising with it, and if we find some elements of it objectionable or just a bit strange, that running emphasis of understanding what is up to us, that's the take home, isn't it, I guess? Let's think about his legacy. Oh yeah, legacy. I was going to talk about this, the Flammarion. I'll just say really briefly. Before we talk about the legacy, I've added this in the last minute. That if we were going to think about what makes Epictetus quite kind of radical, I'd say, is his place in what we could call a materialist tradition. That you've got a whole thread throughout the history of philosophy and myth and religious belief, of looking to the gods, of looking to what is beyond the senses, to looking at what is beyond man with a capital M, to what is in the heavens, kind of maybe in some ways like this, in the stars or beyond, as being our touchstone of pure truth. Now, what Epictetus is saying, no, we don't need to be like Plato and think about a world of forms or something like this. We don't need to, look to a distant prime mover. Everything that is and everything that matters is right here. It's right in front of you. It's inside your head, and that's what you can work with, and that's what you can use. maybe it is tangential, but maybe there's a link here between this emphasis on reason and on the power of reason, and on the demands for reason in the Enlightenment. Imagine Immanuel Kant. What is enlightenment? Sapere aude, dare to reason. Enlightenment is our emergence from self-incurred immaturity. How, for Kant, are we going to leave this immaturity, this being, junior, being naive, through reason, through daring to reason, through daring to think, through actively thinking? Isn't that what Epictetus is trying to sell? Maybe then there is something really important and really useful, really vital, we might say, about the coincidence, well, not coincidence, but about the fact that Epictetus's philosophy survives from the ancient period where so much doesn't. Epictetus and Seneca, both aspects of them fit with Christianity. The medieval Christians found something useful in them, but they're not Christian thinkers. And instead of both of them, there is this kind of, especially more in Epictetus and Seneca, this drive, this encouragement for us to reason and think. And maybe that means that we could think our way out of social structures. And maybe it's by daring to reason and daring to understand the causes of our own judgments and impressions that we end up understanding them. Maybe it's through understanding our own opinions and judgments and impressions that we can collectively decide that we're going to react and do something constructive and powerful about it. And we're going to protest against something which isn't just fate's terrible cruelty, some vile intervention of the gods, but it's something that we can call structural racism, inequality of some sort. And then we act on it. We find other people we can, who we persuade or we act with, and then we fight back. Maybe all of that reasoning, that recognizing, that response, that all fits in with the Stoic imperative to think. Maybe we could disagree about this. Okay, yeah, that's just what we went through. Right, let's get there. Let's talk about his legacy. So this is a nice image, isn't it? So while Epictetus is important in very early Christianity, like in that kind of world, between the end of the Roman Empire and the start of the Middle Ages, he disappears a bit, and so he ends up being like he's slightly lost, and then he is really rediscovered in the 17th century. And there are these like major translations of his work, which is in Greek, bear that in mind. It's in conversation Greek, it's translated to Latin, and it becomes influential in this way. And this is from Oxford, blah blah blah. Right, let's talk about James Stockdale. He made a cameo just earlier. The Stockdale is somebody who talks about how Epictetus didn't just change his life, in a cliche way, but enabled him to survive and help other people survive whilst he was in a terrible prison in Vietnam for about 7 years. And it's interesting because when Stockdale talks about it, he says that he didn't like Epictetus when he first came across him at college. He found it kind of annoying. So he says it. I had read this book, he's talking about the Handbook, what we've been reading, not with contentment, but with annoyance. Statement after statement. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view that they take of them. This is Stoicism. But then it becomes very useful later. So he says how to love our fellow prisoners was within our power. To betray, to propagandize, to disillusion conscientious and patriotic shipmates and destroy their morale so that they would in turn be destroyed was to lose one's proper good. So again, there's something about knowing what is up to us, which means that you can be of better service to others like us in this sense. There's a lot more. I mean, James Stockdale is one well worth researching. He's a very interesting guy, and there's a lot to his Epictetian philosophy. But Epictetus ends up being rediscovered in various different developments in psychotherapy after Freud, after psychoanalysis. On Moodle, I'm going to put up a link to a great article by Donald Robertson, and he talks about the influence of Stoicism on psychotherapy. It's said to begin with a guy called Paul Dubois, the founder of rational psychotherapy. And what we're going to see, I'm going to present 3 psychotherapists here, and there's a big emphasis in all of them on reason and on reasoning your own mental impressions. So Paul Dubois is he's making a shift away from Freud, and his approach is that, from the ancients we get a modern and useful psychotherapy. Quote, if we eliminate from ancient writings a few allusions that gave them local colour, we shall find the ideas of Socrates, Epictetus, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius absolutely modern and applicable to our times. This isn't Paul Dubois. This guy is Albert Ellis. He comes later on, like 50s, 60s, 70s. And he's kind of known, I guess, in the history of CBT, but what his approach is called rational emotional behavioral therapy. I hope I've got that right. But basically, it's the idea that our emotional disturbances, our anxiety, our neuroses or whatever, they're not caused by external events. It's not Philip Larkin, they fuck you up, your mum and dad, they did not mean to, but they do. It's not about your mum and dad. It's not about something terrible that happened to you. It's about our own beliefs, our own irrational beliefs about events, about the scripts, about the things that we attach to those events, the way that we make sense of them. So Ellis says, this principle, which I have inducted for many psychotherapeutic sessions with scores of patients during the last several years, was originally discovered and stated by the ancient Stoic philosophers. The truths of Stoicism were perhaps best set forth by Epictetus. Aaron Beck, another one, cognitive therapy. This is getting much closer to CBT. Again, credits Epictetus, credits Stoicism, but mainly Epictetus, as the breakthrough, as the fuel for this fire. Quote, nevertheless, the philosophical underpinnings go back thousands of years, certainly to the time of the Stoics, who considered man's conceptions or misconceptions of events, rather than the events themselves, as the key to his emotional upsets. So it's that whole thing again, isn't it? It's about what is up to us, and we can't control events themselves, but we can control our own opinions and judgments about them. That's within our power. Epictetus appears in other places. A Man in Full, late 90s novel by Tom Wolfe. The main character, or the main character in this is this millionaire businessman, but he's facing bankruptcy. Charlie Croker, and as this kind of world is falling apart in Atlanta, he makes friends with this young guy called Conrad Hensley. And Conrad Hensley has been in prison, and he accidentally discovers Epictetus' Handbook. This young guy basically kind of helps this older guy to become stoic in his life, and this is kind of ultimately changes the plot around. And so this guy on the cover, Charlie Croker, he's facing bankruptcy, and he's got his opportunity to do a kind of a PR kind of coup or something, a PR move, and then not be bankrupt and then continue being fabulously wealthy. But he decides, I'm not going to do that. I am going to gain freedom, real freedom, that mental freedom, and in the process I'm going to sabotage my wealth. And so there's this memorable bit towards the end of this, The Man in Full, where he's talking about what he gets out of Epictetus. Maybe this is what you will get out of it, I don't know, he said. And so this is from the novel, quote, despite the shouts which ricocheted off the marble walls of the rotunda and doubled, tripled in volume, Charlie felt tranquil. That was exactly what he had found, tranquility. That was exactly what he was blessed with, a mind in accord with nature. So this is the aim. This is what we can get to, tranquility, living in accordance with nature. Final analogy then. We are done. Epictetus says it's about acting. We're on stage, but we're not the director. All the world's a stage. But it's smooth. We'll talk about this in a few weeks, actually, the influence of Stoicism on Shakespeare. Epictetus says, we are the actors in someone else's play. We've been given a part, and we can't change it now. So whatever part we've got, let's play it well. That's all we can do. That's the virtue. That's the skill. You play any role, any situation, any adversity, whatever it is. You live in harmony with nature. You live according to your values. You rigorously and unrelentingly reason. Epictetus, quote, if he wants you to act the part of a beggar, see that you play it skillfully. And similarly, if the part is to be a cripple or an official or a private person, your job is to put on a splendid performance of the role you have been given. Maybe a final thing from Epictetus. If you always bear in mind what belongs to you and what belongs to others, you will never be upset. That's the challenge, isn't it? Okay, right. I think I've set out quite a lot here for us to discuss. The questions for Monday are as follows. Together as a whole group, I want us to cover this. What is the central teaching of Epictetus' philosophy? There's quite a few. So in this, I want to hear from you what you take to be the central teaching of Epictetus' philosophy. I'd encourage you to prepare on your own, in your own mind, and to write down some thoughts on this. Then in groups, we're going to look at what is exactly up to us and what's not up to us. The desire, judgment, what does that really mean, blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to get on to this thorny question. What are the political and social consequences of putting Epictetus' philosophy into practice or not? Where do we go with it? So we're going to discuss all this between 1 and 3, same Zoom link as usual. And then next week, our final Roman, Marcus Aurelius. Have we saved the best till last? If you can, I'd like us to read the whole Meditations. I think it's a brilliant book and it's quite readable. You probably got this one at home. Any translation's okay, don't mind. But I'll circulate one out there so that we can use this. I'm not sure what one I'm going to give you yet. I know there's that Gregory Hayes one in modern English. I'm not sure. Better leave that with me. Okay, all right. Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I'll get back to teaching my little one, Epictetus.